because that's the only bit where you see.
Yeah, I'll switch off the Q&As.
Yeah. Okay. So bumblebees. I'm going to start just with, like I did with honeybees, with a little bit of an overview, and I'm not going to go over recap on much of what I said last week, but if anything I say doesn't make sense because you didn't, not last week, last month, you didn't listen to the first introductory talk, then just ask at the end. But hopefully it will make sense. I'm kind of looking at bumblebees independently of all the other bees for this talk. So there are around 250 species of bumblebees worldwide, and a lot of them are actually in Europe, or most of them Europe, Asia and North America. They are creatures of cooler, more temperate climates. You don't get bumblebees in the tropics. You do get some in the Arctic, a couple in particular, very, I think about, not far, about 900 kilometers from the North Pole, actually. So, and it's believed that they first appeared on the planet some 30 to 40 million years ago. And it's thought that they originated in the Himalayas, basically because that's where the bulk of that's the biggest diversity still is in the Himalayas. So that's what's believed. And they've gradually spread. They never spread naturally down to sort of the southern hemisphere, to Australia or New Zealand. But so if you hear of bumblebees in countries like that, it is because they have been introduced by man. So that's why there are populations of bumblebees in those countries. And of these species, we have around 24 in Great Britain and Ireland. And these 18 of those are fully social bumblebee species. 6 of them are cuckoo species, which I will explain later. And of our 24 bumblebee species, 8 are sadly listed as threatened on the biodiversity action plan list. So bumblebees are suffering, and for some reason, some creatures are coping with climate change, others are not. And bumblebees, so some bees and some insects and animals are moving north as the climate warms. They're sort of expanding their territory north, and bumblebees are basically seem to be squashing themselves. They're not really adapting very well. So that's just, lots of investigations, lots of research being done, but nobody really quite knows why. But the main threats really to bumblebees, and the reason that we've actually had 2 extinctions in the last 100 years, are habitat loss, the changes in farming systems. But I'll go into that more deeply in the final session when we talk about bee decline generally and what we can do to help. So I want to show you, we have of the 16 true social species, 7 of them are what is known as the big 7. 7 of them are fairly common and in your gardens in particular. And I just want to show you, this is not an identification course, but if I just show you the difference between these 7, these are the 7 that you are likely to see. And now is a really good time, if you ever wanted to try to tell the difference between these bees, it would be now, because it's really only the queens that are out and about at the moment. There are 1 or 2 species where they're producing workers already, but it's far easier to tell the queens apart than it is later on in the season, when there are workers of each species and maybe males, and some of them are faded and there are variants. So in this picture here, this top yellow, this is the early bumblebee, Bombus pretorum. I should have mentioned earlier that they're all bombus, the species of bombus, and bombus is, I believe, Latin for booming. So Bombus pretorum, the early bumblebee, called early because she's the first, or this species is the first to start producing workers. They have a shorter nesting life cycle than all of the others. I think it's about 14 weeks as opposed to 18 weeks from the queen starting the nest to, to basically it all being reaching the reproductive stage. So that's the early bumblebee. And you can see she has 2 yellow stripes, and she has a kind of a peachy red coloured tail. And she is the smallest of our bumblebees as well. So even the queens are the same size as some of our worker bumblebees of the larger species. And we've actually got a nest, if anyone's walking past French Mill Lane and I'm there, then stop and ask and I'll show you. There's a nest in the front wall of our garden, which is already producing workers because they are the earliest. Then there's the white-tail bumblebee, white-tail, and there's another bumblebee that looks quite like this. So if I just explain that these 2 stripes here on the white-tailed bumblebee, they are slightly lighter and brighter and more lemony than they are on the buff-tailed bumblebee, which looks very, very alike because it also has a white tail in the worker caste. So that's Bombus lucorum. Bottom right is probably the easiest of them all to identify, the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. Lapidarius, I believe, is Latin for stone or precious gem, and they are so named because they like to nest underneath old stone walls. Then bottom left is the common carder bumblebee, Bombus pascorum, and this here you can see a beautiful ginger thorax. So actually I thought last time I used that term without explaining. So the bumblebee, all insects really are made up of 3 basic parts. There's the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. So this bee has a very gingery thorax and quite a gingery body as well. And then there are 2 more here. The bee on the left is the garden bumblebee, Bombus hortorum, and this is the bee that has the longest tongue of any bee in Britain and Ireland. And although you can't see as clearly as I'd like to show you in this photograph, this bee has 3 yellow stripes, one here on the collar, just at the top of the thorax, another here at the bottom of the thorax where it meets the abdomen, and a 3rd one here. They also have very long faces and white tails. And the one on the right here is the buff-tail bumblebee. So slightly grubbier yellow stripes than the white-tail. And the queen of this species, this is the one you're probably seeing if you're seeing bumblebees in the hedgerows, sort of deep buzzing around and going in and out of little bits of hedgerow growth. It's probably a buff-tailed bumblebee at the moment, and you can tell because the queens have very buff-coloured tails, whereas the workers, when they hatch out, have white tails, just to make things confusing. And the last of the big 7, the 7 most common, because they're generalists, because they're not particularly fussy foragers, is the tree bumblebee. And that's the one species that I'm going to talk about in more detail later. But again, there's no other bee quite like her in Europe. So a very gingery thorax, a black abdomen, and a white tail, like a tricolor colour. So those are our so-called big 7. They're the ones that you should see all of these in your gardens. I've seen all of them except for the white-tailed bumblebee already this year in Shaftesbury. So life cycle. Now's such a good time to talk about the life cycle. And this is a beautiful queen buff-tailed bumblebee. You can see quite clearly the buffish tail. And the way that the life cycle begins, and for different species, it starts at different times of the year, but I'm just going to generalize and talk about the buff-tailed bumblebee. So the queens come out of hibernation basically when the weather warms up sufficiently so that they have warmed up and they are going to come out. There's going to be forage around for them. Things are changing because of climate change and they're coming out too early sometimes. But as a rule of thumb, they'll emerge sometime in February or March. And as soon as they emerge from their winter hibernation, they've usually been hibernating for up to 6 months, actually, sometimes longer in some species. And they are the only bees that have survived the winter. We'll come full circle round to that in a moment. So out of hibernation, and the first thing they need to do is to stock up on nectar after their long winter sleep, and on pollen. They need the pollen to develop their ovaries. And then you see this very characteristic sort of zigzagging low to the ground. You see these huge, great, big, deep, buzzy bumblebees, and they're prospecting for nests. They're looking for somewhere to establish a nest and a colony. And what they're searching for, these, especially the buff-tail bumblebees, most of our bumblebees, ground nesting, is an abandoned mouse's nest. This is kind of prime real estate for a bumblebee, because it's already been, there's a tunnel created, there's probably nesting material in it, it's likely to be waterproof. So once she has found a suitable nesting site, our queen will sort of rearrange the nesting material a little bit. So she's making, I suppose, a bit like a tennis ball cavity. And then once she's happy that she's got a suitable nest, she then flies backwards and forwards many, many times. And you know that you've got a bumblebee establishing a nest if you see a queen coming back with pollen on her back legs. And when she's collected sufficient pollen, she sort of squashes it all into a little ball, and flattens it a little bit. And then she secretes, a little bit like, if you remember the honeybees, when they're creating comb, they secrete wax from their abdomens to create the comb. Well, the bumblebees secrete some wax, and they put a little layer of wax over the top of the pollen, and then they lay between 6 and 8 eggs into that. And then this is where they get really, really clever. So what the bumblebee does then is she spreads herself out, she spreads her body out. She puts a little bit more wax on top of them first, but spreads her body then out on top of this little brood cell, and she disconnects her wings, the flight muscles inside her thorax, and vibrates until she raises her body temperature to around 32 degrees. And this basically is a little bit like brood. It's called brooding. It's very much it's just brooding the eggs so that they will hatch out in the same way as birds brood. So she's created the perfect environment here for the eggs to hatch out. And the other thing she does is, because she needs to be in the nest a lot during these first few days. It takes 4 to 5 days for them to hatch out. So the other things that she does, or has done before she starts to brood, is she secretes a little bit more wax from underneath her abdomen. She makes a tiny little pot. It's like a honey pot, basically. And she fills this, she goes backwards and forwards and collects nectar. And then the nectar, when she brings it back, she absorbs a little bit of the water content in the nectar into her body. So she regurgitates something slightly thicker, but still pretty runny. It's not quite the same as honey as we know it, but she keeps that in the pot, and the pot is close to the entrance. She's sitting backwards from the entrance a little bit, and that way she's able to guard the entrance, but also take little sips of the nectar, so that if she has to stay brooding for a few days, or the weather is too challenging for her to get out and about, she won't starve. So after 4 to 5 days, the eggs hatch into little grub-like larvae, and start munching on the pollen that she's provided for them. And if she needs to, she'll top it up with a little bit of nectar. And after a little while, they're all in the same brood cell, as it were. But after a while, it's called molting, they shed their skins, they grow, they eat, they grow. And then they wrap themselves in a cocoon. So each individual larvae wraps themselves in an individual, like a brown coloured cocoon, and in that cocoon pupation takes place. So over the next couple of weeks, they go in looking like something from Alien, and they emerge a few weeks later as fully grown adult bumblebees. So there's no such thing as a baby bee. Once they emerge as adult bumblebees, they don't grow or change in any way afterwards. And at this stage, and for quite a few weeks, many weeks to come, all of these eggs that are laid and all of the bees that hatch out are female workers. So this is the worker caste. And if you remember when we talked about the difference between social bees and solitary bees, the social bees have a worker caste. They have a queen, workers with roles to play, and then males. So once this first batch of female workers have hatched out, the queen has meantime started to lay more eggs, but the queen is very unlikely to leave the nest afterwards. But the worker bees, these female worker bees, will more or less, depending on size, actually, some will be larger than others, and the larger ones tend to be the foragers because they can bring back more pollen and nectar, and the smaller ones tend to be the cleaner uppers and the nursemaids and feed the larvae of the next brood, and so it goes on. So the queen will lay another brood and another brood, all female workers. And it depends on the species as to how many bees you might get in any one nest. But with the buff-tailed bumblebee and with some of the other large sort of underground nesting bees, you might, at the height of the summer, in a very good year, a really healthy nest, you might get up to 300 or 400 bumblebees. But with other species like the garden bumblebee, maybe only 50, 50 bumblebees would indicate a very healthy nest. So it goes on, sort of continues and continues. And this is the buff-tailed bumblebee under the ground. And I just want to show you, before I continue with the life cycle, some other types of nesting sites that different bumblebees will go for. So top left, tussocky grass, that's really mossy. That's where the beautiful, the common carder bee, and there are other carder bees. That's the sort of nesting habitat they choose, often where there have been field voles, and they card the moss into a little ball.
I've done, babe.
And they're more sort of above ground, or just not really, they don't dig down. Then gardeners often, the first time you'll notice
I've done.
garden is in a compost heap. They love compost heaps. They're perfect for them, beautifully warm. And here you've got, so this is I can't see, it looks as if it could be an early nesting, but maybe not, I can't see. But this nest here, again, this is a surface nest in amongst sort of leaf litter and moss on the surface. And then this picture here of the wall, this is where our early bumblebees are nesting at the moment. And actually, just a little bit on, less than a metre away from this hole, we've got a queen buff-tailed bumblebee also establishing a nest. So that's quite exciting. So back to the cycle. It's grown and grown and grown. You get to the height of the summer. And at the height of the summer, this is an image from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. You've got the queen is still laying eggs. The workers are busy beneath the ground, tending to the larvae and collecting the nectar and the pollen to bring back to feed them. And then at some stage, right at the height of the bumblebee's life cycle, the queen starts to produce male and daughter queens, so male bumblebees and daughter queens. And the way she produces the males is quite weird, actually. So she's already, she had already mated last summer before she went into hibernation, and she stores the sperm sort of over winter and throughout this whole nest creating cycle, and when she releases the sperm each time she lays an egg for the female workers, but when she lays the male eggs, she doesn't release any sperm. So these male eggs in effect don't have a father. So that's how the males, there is a name, Marika will be able to tell me later for it, but that's how the males hatch out. And she also lays daughter queens, and it's not as well known. It's not as simple as with honeybee societies. The larger cells are built, and the larvae are fed extra amounts of royal jelly, but it's not quite known how the queen lays daughter queens, but she does. This is towards the end of the life cycle. Now, when the males hatch out, they leave the nest and they don't return. The workers don't allow them back in because they do no work. And the male's job really is to mate with the queens when they emerge from other nests. So, and one of the ways that it's really easy, this is sort of, you should be able to, by May, there will be some males, the early bumblebee males will be out and about by May. And one of the ways to tell if it's a male bumblebee is because you will find them, they sleep inside flowers. They have nowhere to go at night, no home to go to. So they sleep inside or underneath flowers. You often catch them congregating underneath thistles or alliums, sort of hanging underneath. But this is an early bumblebee male. And I can tell by looking at him, there's a number of reasons. First of all, he's got lots of bright yellow hairs on the front, on the top of his thorax. And the second thing is, if you look at his legs, sort of long, skinny, hairy legs, whereas the females all have pollen baskets. They have this part of the hind leg is widened and flattened to create a pollen basket to collect pollen. So that's a good way to tell. And I'm going to show you another male of the same species. This is a better photograph. You can see here. This again is an early bumblebee male, and you can see very clearly the colours of the tail here, and this beautiful yellow. And then I'm just going to show you another way you can always tell if it's a male. And this is a white-tailed bumblebee, and he has a moustache. Male bumblebees have moustaches. They have this beautiful little facial hair, and this one's quite sort of Charlie Chaplin-esque, but they're not all the same. I saw another here. It looks a little bit more Mexican with his moustache. So that's the males. And the males, just so you know, don't have stings. No male bee possesses a stinger. So it's very, very safe to invite them to sort of crawl onto your hand so you can have a better look. And I just want to say something about stinging as well. A lot of people are scared of bees because they think they're going to be stung. And bees have better things to do than sting human beings. And you might, if you're very close to a very touchy honeybee nest or hive, you get too close and you might find that they might come out to defend their colony, and you might get stung that way. If you stand on a bee or if you sit on a bee, of course you're going to risk being stung. The thing with the bumblebees is that their stinger just goes straight in and straight out. So people often ask if all bees die after they sting. Bumblebees don't. Bumblebees don't have a barb, whereas honeybees have a little barb on their sting. So sadly, if a honeybee ever stings, it pulls its insides out and it does die after stinging. But bumblebees are very gentle creatures. I take a lot of very close-up photographs of bumblebees. I get that close to them, and if they're on flowers and foraging, I try not to get in their way, but they're not, as I say, interested in me. And if they were threatened, if they felt threatened, and I go further, so if they felt threatened but didn't have the energy to fly away, they have a way of telling you, and it's this is a tree bumblebee. And what they do is they lift a middle leg in the air, and that's called posturing. And if you back off, the leg comes down. And if you go forward again, the leg comes up again. And if you keep going, they'll put both legs up in the air and eventually roll on their backs and show you their sting. But this is just bluffing. They don't want to sting. They're not aggressive creatures, but and the obvious thing to do is to back off, because clearly if a bee is doing this, hasn't got the energy to fly off, and it's asking you politely to move back. I've seen lots of videos, a few American videos where they talk about them high-fiving. They're not high-fiving, they're sort of saying, please go away, please leave me alone. So that's the males are out and about. Once the males have left, the daughter queens, it's the turn of the daughter queens then to emerge and to leave the nest. And although they do go backwards and forwards to the nest for some time before leaving for good. And when they leave for good, the next thing that needs to happen is the mating. Now, different bumblebees worldwide adopt different strategies. The males adopt different strategies for mating with their queens. And there's one of them, we don't have many of them, we don't have any in this country that do this. There's one type of bumblebee will perch. Basically, they'll find a twig or a rock or something, and they take up that space, and it's their space, and they just pounce on anything that flies past, usually in the hope that it's a bumblebee of their species. So that's a very primitive way of getting their queens. And then what most of our bumblebees do in Britain and Ireland is they patrol. So each species, just so they don't all bump into each other, tends to have a different height. So some are ground level, some are flower, shrub level, some quite high up in the trees. And there's one or two species that do what they're called hilltopping. They like to go to the top of hills to patrol. So what happens is the males, when the queens are about to emerge, the males do a lot of, they fly around and around, or up and down more often than not, in what's called a circuit, a patrol, scent marking the leaves or the twigs, and they do this with their mouth parts. They kind of like chew, and they leave a scent which is detectable. You can detect it if there are a lot of males scent marking a particular tree. It's kind of like a citrusy smell, but they each have a different smell and a different area. And what happens then is the queens of this species detect the smell, and they fly to where the males are, and they tend to, when they get close to the pheromone, this pheromone, they tend to sit down or stand on a leaf or on the ground or whatever. So that's when the males mate with them. Now, with bumblebees, the queens, as a rule, only mate the once. There are exceptions, but most of our bumblebees species, the queens only mate once. And also, given the fact that there are around 7 times as many male bumblebees as there are queens, not many of these males actually get to mate in their lifetime. So that's patrolling. And then the final way is the tree bumblebee's way of mating. And I will come to that later when I tell you more about the tree bumblebees. And I've only ever seen a few mating pairs of bumblebees. This is, again, the early bumblebee. I see a lot of early bumblebees mating on Phacelia. So after mating has taken place, the newly mated queen then stocks up, she stocks up on nectar and begins to search for a place to hibernate over winter. And there are 1 or 2 species, including the early bumblebee, who have completed their life cycle so early that they might, instead of going into hibernation, the newly mated queen might start another whole colony, because that species has got enough time to get a couple of life cycles in before winter sets in. But the majority, after they've mated, will look for a suitable place to spend the winter. And they usually they like to choose a north-facing site, a slope. So the slope is useful because if there's flooding, then they're not going to be as susceptible as they might be if they were in the ground at the bottom of a valley. And north-facing, because they don't want to be lulled out into a false sense of security and brought out of hibernation because, on a hot spell in December or January. And of course, that is happening a lot more now. And that's no good for them. They need a deep, long winter sleep. The deeper and the longer, the colder they are, the better. And then they'll come out, hopefully, when there are sufficient flowers to sustain them. and they can cope actually with really, really low temperatures. They have a kind of an antifreeze substance in their body that means that they're able to stay alive in sub-zero temperatures. So the colder the better. So that is the life cycle. Oh, and meanwhile, back in the nest, the old queen, bless her, is just worn out, and she's had to switch off some pheromones when she starts to lay the unfertilized male eggs. And when that happens, anarchy breaks out. And although you never get anarchy in a honeybee colony, you do in a bumblebee colony. And the female workers all start to try to lay eggs of their own. They haven't been mated, but they are able to produce eggs. And the queen at first will run around gobbling them up, but eventually, you know, she's old and tired. She gives up and she dies. And then if there are eggs, and if they do hatch out from the workers, they'll hatch out again as males. So you often get a surge at the end of a life cycle of male bumblebees, but they will come from the female workers. And then gradually all the female workers die out. The detritivores move in, and you know, the nest is cleaned up, and you may or may not have another bumblebee come to the same site the following year, but as a rule, you know, they don't come deliberately to that site. It's not, they're not perennials, they are annuals. You know, that's that nest done. And the males also just gradually fade away and don't survive the winter either. So that is the life cycle of the bumblebee. And I just want to now tell you about the tree bumblebee, because this bee is a little bit different. So the tree bumblebee is quite new. It's kind of like a newbie on the block. They've been around in the United Kingdom for, I can't think, 10, 12 years, but don't quote me on that, not long. And they arrived from northern France, and it's thought that they've arrived naturally. You know, they are a bee that's expanded their range, and they do very well in the United Kingdom, because as they're the tree bumblebees, they're called tree bumblebees because they like to nest in old holes in trees. And they also love to nest in bird boxes. And we are a nation of bird lovers and bird box putter-uppers. So, you know, there's so many gardens in this country with bird boxes. And the tree bumblebees will, if there's already some nesting material inside the bird box, it's no good if there's not, will move in. And they establish their nest, and they go through their life cycle in exactly the same way as those bees that nest under the ground or in cavities in walls. But when they reach the stage where they have produced males and are producing daughter queens, things differ with this species. And it's at this time when the queens, the new queens, are ready to emerge. This is a time of year at the height of the summer when beekeeper swarm collectors are inundated with calls from people who think they've got honeybee swarms in their bird box or in their roof, because they like to nest in the eaves of roofs as well, or in tumble dry events, all sorts of places. And so this is a tree bumblebee colony inside an old bird box. And what happens after the males have left, of course they're not allowed back in, and you can see in the middle that tree bumblebees always, you see these bees gathered. These are the guard bees gathered around the entrance, and I've been really close to one of these nests and seen when the bees, so you've got this little hole with all these little bees looking out, and when a new bee, a worker bee, flies back, they touch each other's antennae. It's obviously a scent. That's how they smell with their antennae. And they check, yeah, this is one of ours. This is one of ours. So she goes in. But the swarm thing that people see is when the queens are ready to leave, they produce pheromones. And all the males from miles around come and they dance outside the bee box. And it's like a little swarm of bumblebees, and of course they're usually high up, so you usually don't see them if they're up in the eaves. You can't tell that they're bumblebees and not honeybees, and they're dancing around like this, and the bees inside are guarding and making sure they don't come in. And then comes the time that the queens have to run the gauntlet. They have to emerge, they have to fly. And when they do, it's quite a funny thing to witness, because this is a little bit like the perch and pounce tactic, only it's a flying and pounce. And the males pounce and knock them to the ground and mate with them. And that's different to the way our other bumblebees patrol. But also with this species, the queen will mate more than once, so that's quite unusual as well. She'll mate a few times. So that's the tree bumblebees. But so if you do have a bird box, watch out for the tree bumblebees this year. And gosh, really important, don't when you see this dancing behavior, that is not a time to go close. You know, I speak from bitter experience and very sore ears, because I did go too close. I was oblivious. This was before anyone really knew about tree bumblebees, going back 10 years. I was walking along the banks of the River Severn, and found a tree bumblebee colony inside an old hollow, an elder tree. And I had a camera, so I was trying to video it. And I was sort of close up and saying, and you know, bees are very gentle and they don't want to hurt you. And stupidly, I was in the flight path, and an incoming worker sort of flew into my head, and I went like that. I reacted foolishly, and she was okay. But well, the workers charged out and chased me down the banks of the River Severn and stung my ear. So just beware. Be a little bit respectful of the bees around the time that you see the dancing males, and don't go close to them. They don't like strimmers and lawnmowers close to their nests. So, but they are fine as long as you just show them a little bit of respect, and they will die out. So you never need to worry. Let them live, you know, let them see out their life cycle. If you've got children, just warn the children not to go close during the queen emerging time. But it is, and these are the ultimate opportunists, these bees. So this is not my photograph. I saw that I pinched this from the internet. I shouldn't have done, but I can't find a credit. So they're nesting here, tree bumblebees, in one of these things that you get at the bottom of a block of flats. And then here, this is a garden that Rob, my husband, used to work in. And 3 years ago, there were great tits nesting inside this cannon. And 2 years ago, tree bumblebees. They moved into the cannon. And then even crazier, in the farm opposite, the farmer, this is a muck spreader, and he took this muck spreader out twice, 3 times a week with its resident tree bumblebee nest. So if you can see, it's in that little spot here. I've taken a few photographs so you can see exactly where it is. And he's great, this farmer, David he was called, and he did get stung a couple of times, you know, because these were very confused bees being taken backwards and forwards, and he always carefully parked it in exactly the same place, but he let them be. He let them finish their entire life cycle, which was great. So that is the tree bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum. So yeah, watch out for those. And you might, if just as an aside, if you have Cotoneaster, you will get tree bumblebees. Whatever you see honeybees on, you'll also see tree bumblebees, because they are one of the shorter tongued of the bumblebees. They tend to go for the same plants as honeybees. So look out on your Cotoneaster. So those these are all nests, natural, not so much natural nesting sites, but nesting sites that these bees have chosen in the tree bumblebees case, because they're opportunists. But you can encourage bumblebees to nest in your garden without spending a fortune on the very, very beautiful oak bumblebee nesting boxes, which sometimes do the job but often don't. And this is just a great thing to try. So this is an upturned plant pot, piece of slate on the top, just to make sure that the rain doesn't get into the hole. And you see here, there's a piece of hose. I'm going to show you now a diagram from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust site. So this is the entrance, and it looks, of course, like the hole to an old mouse's nest. So the hose pipe here coming up into the underturned plant pot, and you might put a little bit of a wire mesh at the bottom, and nesting material, if you can find an old mouse's nest, or if you can go to a pet shop and get some, pet shops don't have guinea pigs and hamsters in them anymore, but yeah, anything, sort of nesting material that's been used. And then the one other thing to do is to put a few holes, it doesn't show you here, but put a few holes at the bottom of the hose pipe here, just so that if there's a lot of water, it'll drain out. So yeah, you could do that and see what happens. Moving on to cuckoo bumblebees that I mentioned earlier. So cuckoo bumblebees do pretty much what it says on the tin. You know, they're very much like the cuckoo birds. And we have 6 species in this country, and I've seen 3 of them. 3 of them in Shaftesbury, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk to you about the 2 that you're most likely to see soonest. In fact, people have already been seeing this one. This is Bombus vestalis, the vestal cuckoo bee. Now, so the thing about cuckoo bees is that they don't do any work to raise their own young. So with cuckoo bumblebees, you don't have a caste system. You don't have queens and workers and males. You just have females and males, and this is a female. So what the cuckoo females do is they've been mated at the end of last summer, gone into hibernation. And you can see this one looks very like, she's very similar to the white-tailed and the buff-tailed bumblebee in appearance. So what she does is she comes out of hibernation and she stocks up on nectar, and then she goes in search of a white-tailed, in this case, a white-tailed or a buff-tailed bumblebee's nest. And she'll find them by following the scent that the workers are taking back, or just by prospecting, looking for it. But when she finds a nest, she sort of will lurk outside for a little while, and then she goes down into the tunnel, and she'll go deep into the nesting material at the side of the nest, and she hides until she's taken on the scent of the other bees in the nest. So by the time she crawls out from the place she's been lurking, she appears to, or smells to the worker bumblebees like one of their own. So they're not alerted to the danger that their queen is in, because what this bee does then is she attacks the host queen, and she stands a very good chance of winning the battle, because there is always a battle, because she is better equipped, firstly, to withstand stings. So she's all bees. This bumblebee's beautiful colour. You know, you say, what colour is that bumblebee? It's black and yellow and white, or some are black and red. But their ectoskeletons, their skin, as it were, made out of chitin, is always black, and it's only the hairs that have the colour. So the chitinous sort of ectoskeleton of a bumblebee with a cuckoo bumblebee is thicker. Also, because she doesn't do any of the work herself in the nest, she doesn't have gaps, little slits at the bottom of her abdomen, beneath her abdomen, to secrete wax. So she's not vulnerable like the queen is beneath her abdomen. So that there is a battle, and she, more often than not, might kill the host queen. And once she has, she then rapidly starts laying her own eggs in the nest, and she's able to lay far more quickly than the true queen bumblebee was able to lay. And then the workers in the nest, they don't know otherwise. You know, they'll come to the defense of their queen during a battle, and often the cuckoo female will be killed. But if she does win the battle, the workers in that nest will rear her young. So it's a very quick, easy way of reproducing and having someone else rear young, just like the cuckoo bird. So occasionally there are some species, and they tend to have, different cuckoos are associated with certain true bumblebee species. And with some of them, I can't remember which, they're less likely to actually kill the queen, but more likely to cohabit and just gobble up all the true bumblebees' eggs and just keep laying her own. But either way, once this starts happening, there will be this nest is not going to produce true bumblebees of the species that started it off. So that is the Vestal cuckoo bumblebee. And again, you'll notice her because she has just this one yellow stripe, and then she's all black with a white tail, but a very, very noticeable yellow, a lemony yellow band just here. So look out for these bees because they're out and about already. I don't know in Shaftesbury, but they will be soon. And then I wanted to show you another one that's also, it's quite common. You get quite a lot of these around Shaftesbury. And this is the cuckoo of the red-tailed bumblebee. So this is Bombus rupestris. And these bees, she's huge. She's huge, and her wings, you can't tell here, but her wings are darker. They're sort of like a dark browny black. And when these cuckoo bees come to rest, they behave differently to other bees because they have no work to do. They're not in a hurry to go anywhere. So they tend to be more lethargic, more clumsy and heavy, and dare I say it, they they look quite mean, some of them. So that's the cuckoo bumblebees, and yeah, worth looking out for. And of course, if there are plenty of cuckoo bumblebees around, it means that there's a healthy population of their host bee. These interactions have been going on for as long as the bumblebees have been around. So don't worry about cuckoo bumblebees. Right, collecting pollen and nectar. So I talked a little bit about some of the more general relationships between flowering plants and their insect visitors and pollinators last month with the first talk. But there are a few ways that there are a few things that bumblebees can do that the other bees can't do. They can reach the parts of the plants that other bumblebees can't reach, or other bees can't reach. So they visit the plants, the bumblebees, for nectar and pollen. Nectar to fuel, just to give them energy so that they can keep flying and working, and pollen to take back to the nest. And this is incredible. This is it is actually a buff-tailed worker. You can't tell, but it is buff-tailed worker, and she's carrying these huge loads of pollen in her corbiculae, in the pollen baskets on the sides of her legs. And the bumblebee can carry over 50% of her body weight in pollen back to the nest, as well as another 30-40% of her body weight in nectar in her honey crop, which is quite phenomenal. And you can tell with this, the same as the honeybee, I mentioned this last time, that this is not going to fall off on the way back. And if it did fall off, it's not going to be viable for pollination. It's the pollen that collects on the bumblebee's hairs that brush off on the plants and bring about pollination and fertilization. This goes back to the nest, and when she gets back to the nest, she turns around and she backs into the little wax sort of cells where she's going to deposit, and she uses her middle legs to brush it off. So this is to feed the larvae back in the nest. Now, we've talked about different length tongues, but for anyone who wasn't here for the last talk, bees, as well as being many, many different sizes, some of the bees are smaller than a grain of rice, and then there are solitary bees that are even bigger than the largest bumblebees, queen bumblebees you've ever seen. But the other thing that differs with all of these bees, not just because of the size of the bee, is the length of their tongue. So different bees, and I'm talking all bees here, not just bumblebees, visit different plants for nectar. And and so you've got some of our bumblebee species have relatively short lengthed tongues, like the red-tailed bumblebee. So you'll see her a lot on plants, coltsfoot, I think. Again, you just start to notice which plants you see them on, and if you see other bumblebees, they'll also be shortish tongued bumblebees, or if you see solitary bees, they're probably shortest tongued solitary bees. So that's a bumblebee with a shortish tongue, shortish tongue twister tongue. And then you've got the common carder bumblebee has a slightly longer tongue, so it's not long, but slightly longer. So you get this bee on different plants, and you get this bumblebee a lot on white dead nettle. They love the dead nettles and other and legumes. They, as you walk along the hedgerows, if you hear a bumblebee and you see white dead nettles, or there's yellow archangel is starting to flower now as well, look to see if it's this bumblebee, because 9 times out of 10 it is this beautiful common carder bumblebee. Then you get the bumblebee with the longest tongue that I mentioned earlier, the garden bumblebee. And this is the bumblebee and the common carder bumblebee that you'll most likely get flying in and out of foxgloves. So different length tongues. And there's also the size of the bumblebee means that they can force their way into plants like snapdragons that the smaller bees just can't access. They're also able to access sometimes the more complicated structured, the plants with more complex structures. And I just want to show you this because it's really interesting. This poor bee is trapped inside, she's dead, and she is a garden bumblebee, inside a plant called acanthus. I don't know if you know acanthus, but you can't see. The acanthus, basically the petal, top petal usually covers that. And this is not a native plant. This is a Mediterranean plant. And in the Mediterranean, it's pollinated mostly by a solitary bee called the violet carpenter bee, which is enormous and which is able to fly in and get out again. Lots of our bumblebees, I find quite a lot of bumblebees are not able to get back out. These structures here are almost like bamboo. They're quite solid. So yeah. Yeah. If you've got acanthus, it's fine. It's a great plant, but it's not a plant I would choose to plant again, having seen the fate of some of these bees. Then you have plants like the tomato, and so the tomato plant, you can see here, it's tight closed. You can't even see. You can't see the anthers inside. You can't see the pollen. Honeybees would not have a clue how to access the pollen here, and most solitary bees also wouldn't know what to do. But bumblebees, this is a tomato, is a Mexican plant, I think originated in Mexico. Bumblebees have mastered the art in a way that is quite incredible. So what the bumblebee does is she flies towards the tomato and she grasps, you can see here, she grasps the flower, then she disconnects the flight muscles inside her thorax in the same way as she does to brood in the nest, or even when she wants to warm up on a cold day. You know, bumblebees, although they're cold-blooded, they are able to warm up on cold days where other insects can't, by vibrating the muscles inside their thorax. But what she does here is she vibrates the muscles, and she vibrates until it gets faster and faster, and she reaches something like, again, don't quote me, about 400 hertz. And at that moment, and the flower, the tomato flower, they opens, or it's not that the flower opens, the anthers suddenly release their pollen, and it bursts out, it sprays out all over the abdomen of the bumblebee. And this is how your tomatoes get cross-pollinated, open pollinated, so you know, for genetic diversity. And there are many more plants that require this technique to be pollinated, and it's called sonication. Sonication is its scientific name, or buzz pollination. So these bumblebees are buzz pollinating the tomato plants. Sadly, because they're capable of doing this, and humans know they are farmed now. These Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, it is bred now in mostly in Eastern Europe. I think they're starting to breed in this country too, and they are shipped to where there are acres, millions of acres of polytunnels and glass houses of tomatoes and other plants that need to be buzz pollinated, and the bumblebees are released into the tunnels in colonies, and they do their work. And this is, you think, yeah, like that's not, it's not so great. They're being bred, it's not so great, but there's an extra sting in the tail, because so in North America this has been going on for a long time, and that these bumblebees that are bred in captivity have been taking disease. So they're bred in Eastern Europe. They're shipped to, or were shipped to America and to the UK, do the pollinating, but they take disease and with them, and everything about it is just wrong on so many levels, because they can't be released into the wild because they're not native. They're not a native subspecies. So they are destroyed. They're destroyed when they finished doing the pollinating, but some of them do escape, and the ones that have escaped have spread disease in North America to such extent that one of the most common bumblebees on, I can't remember whether it's the West Coast or the East Coast, is now endangered because they have picked up this disease. I think it's called Chrysidia bombi, basically where so a healthy bee, when a healthy bee goes to a plant, it can smell, it can tell whether another bee has recently been and emptied that plant of pollen or nectar, because bees leave their feet, they leave a smelly foot smell on the plants. But the bumblebees that have this particular parasite, this particular disease, are unable to tell whether a plant has already been had its nectar and pollen taken. So they go to plants, they spend all their energy going to plants looking for food and starve. So wrong on so many levels that this happens. This is us exploiting. So moving away from that, back to buzz pollination on a happier note, the bumblebees in your garden also do this disconnecting of their wings on poppies and lots of open cup-shaped flowers. So this is a Welsh poppy, and you can tell that you've got bumblebees buzz foraging in your garden by the type of noise, by the high-pitched noise they make when they do this. And I've got now, I really hope this works. You won't be able to, this is a video, I'm going to play a little video, and I know that for you, because of broadband issues, it'll jump a bit, but I still hope you'll be able to hear the sound of this bumblebee buzz foraging. So although it probably won't have played very well, I hope you were able to hear that she started off with a very bzz, 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 and then as she flew off, bzz. So that's a very, very different sound that you get with the buzz foraging. So natural predators. I'm not going to talk about decline. There's a lot I could talk about that I'm going to leave for the final session here, but I do want to talk about the bumblebee's natural predators, because there are many of them, and I use the word natural here. These interactions have been around for as long as there have been bumblebees. So the first I've already talked about, cuckoo bumblebees. What I didn't mention is that occasionally, once a bumblebee has found and established a nest, because there's such big competition for nesting sites now, you might get another bumblebee queen of the same or of another species coming in and battling with her to oust her. So that happens. But one of the main threats to large established bumblebee nets is badgers. There are other mammals as well, rats and other rodents, depending on what stage the bumblebee colony is at. But with the badgers, it's usually because it's a very large nest. It's right at towards the end or the height of its life cycle, and so they can smell the nectar. But the good news is that by that time, the bumblebee nest has probably already produced the males and daughter queens. So this is nature read in tooth and claw. Then birds, bee eaters eat bees. We do occasionally have bee eaters visiting this country, but they not usually. But birds like great tits and blue tits and even robins have worked out how to catch bumblebees. They sort of catch them when they're in trees, especially if they're visiting lime trees. They get very, 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 very dozy. Sorry, I've just got a lot of little lines on my slide and I can't work out where they've come from, which is odd, but that's okay. So with the birds, the lime trees have something in them that is not, it's not so that it's toxic, but it's a little bit like bees getting drunk, and at this time the birds are easily able to catch them, and they wipe the stings on a branch, and you often will find a lot of half bumblebees underneath lime trees, or even outside a bumblebee nest. Often there are birds, I've seen footage of birds sitting waiting outside nests. Parasitic wasps and flies, also they're quite gruesome. They lay eggs inside bumblebees. Crab spiders, I'll show you a photograph of one in a moment, lie in wait on top of flowers, and they will attack a small spider, as tiny little spiders. They sometimes take on the color of the flower. If they're sort of adult females are able, a bit like chameleons, take on the color of the flower, and then they will attack the bee, and they paralyze it, and then they suck out the insides, and all you get is the shell of a dead bee. And the bumblebee wax moth, just as you get wax moths in honeybee hives, there is a particular moth that lays its eggs inside bumblebee nests, and the larvae, they weave this rubbery skin sort of substance that blocks I've seen this in a bumblebee nest in one of our gardens previously, blocks the entrance, so that they entomb the bumblebees, but also, they feed off the wax, but they also feed off the larvae. And I'm just going to show you a photograph of I don't know if your pictures have now got this funny blue stripe on them. Mine have suddenly got blue stripes on them. So this is a red-tailed bumblebee, and you can see this crab spider here has taken on it. I can't tell whether it's buttercup or marsh marigold or something, but anyway, it's taken on the color of this flower and caught this poor unsuspecting bumblebee. And then the other thing that you might see, you will see a lot on these new queens, is these little mites, tiny little mites, a little bit like ticks. Don't worry about them. This is just mites hitching a lift. They've hibernated with the queen underground over winter, and they're just hitching a lift out onto the open, and they'll drop off on a flower and maybe catch a lift on another queen into a new nest. And I've actually just a very lucky couple of shots here. You see here, I saw this bumblebee land on, this is sea holly, and I noticed a mite, and I didn't notice till I was looking at the photographs later, but the mites crawled off here. So this is doing exactly what they do, crawling off and going to hang out and wait for another bumblebee to come along. So there's a lot more, you can go as deep as you want with bumblebees, and I'm going to recommend a couple of books in a moment if you want to know more. There you can find out the whole nesting cycle it differs between the primitive and slightly less primitive bumblebees, that there are different ways that they feed the larvae, and so many more fascinating bits of information that I've not been able to include this evening, much of which I just don't know. I've been researching and watching and reading about bumblebees for about 12-15 years now, and I still feel I know next to nothing. But I want to just show you the picture that I started with again, and tell you about this bee. This bee is the great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus, the distinguished bumblebee. And she is very rare. She's been forced up to the northwestern edges of Scotland and the western coast of Ireland, and also the Outer Hebrides, the islands of the Outer Hebrides. She is a victim, almost certainly, or she is a victim of intensification of farming and changes in the ways in agriculture. And she's got nowhere else to go now. And she also seems to be more susceptible than other bees like her to climate change. So we went, my husband and I, Rob and I, went to the Outer Hebrides a few years ago in search of this bumblebee. And on the very, very windy days there's another beautiful bumblebee there called the Moscarda bumblebee, which is also is not particularly common. And it was flying on the windy days, but the great yellow bumblebee wasn't. So this is why the bees are up against so much with the changes that have already happened, that anything we can do to help has got to be a good thing. And one of the ways, if you want to find out what you can do to help bumblebees, I would suggest you have a look at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust was set up 15 years ago, something like that, maybe 12 years ago. And it's fantastic because it's educating, informing children, adults, farmers, groups, communities, but it's also, as well as educating, it's also creating habitat. There are lots of projects. They work with other wildlife organisations, lots of different projects, and their website's fabulous, really great for children. So many books. I was looking through my books earlier and thinking, how do I decide which to recommend? But this book on the right, The Field Guide to Bumblebees of Great Britain and Ireland, is brilliant. And there's a new revised edition. I've got the old edition. It's just really simple. It is pocket-sized ish. So it's a great one to take out in the field with you. And this book here, or any book by Dave Goulson, for any of you who don't know, is an entomologist, an expert, a professor, and bumblebees are his thing. He set up the Bumblebee Conservation Trust alongside Ben Darville, and he has written books, so reference books, really, really good. Well, that is a great yellow bumblebee, look on the front of his book. But he's also written a series of books that are more narrative, full of information, and has just produced a book, I think this month, called Gardening for Bumblebees, which I haven't read yet, but I know it will be good. And again, I hope you won't mind me ending just with a little plug for my book, Dancing with Bees, which, because the shops are opening soon, and I happen to know that Nick at the Potting Shed has got some copies there, or you could go to if you Google Brigit Strawbridge blog, you could buy it directly from me, and I could sign it and put a little bookmark in, or you could email me and come and collect it if it's within the next few weeks, because we're moving at the end of this month. And if you do Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. I do a lot of Twitter. And if you'd like to buy me a coffee, this talk is free, and I want it to be as accessible as possible. But yeah, I've got a buy me a coffee link. It's a little button on my blog site. I think there's also a link on my Twitter thing. So thank you again so much for listening. And again, I want to say facts, figures, numbers, names, you don't need to worry about remembering them. It's just, this is the most perfect time to get out in the gardens and walk around the lanes of Shaftesbury and areas of Shaftesbury. Check out, watch and see if you can see a nesting queen bumblebee, or just get to know the bumblebees in your garden, and do with it what you want. So I'm going to stop my screen share now, which means I'll go back